Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we dig into a stack of sources and pull out the key insights just for you. Today we're getting into some pretty mind-bending philosophy with Ibrahim book, Existence and Reality, New Realism in Contemporary Philosophy and the Ontology of Fields of Sense, our mission. To navigate its 4 core chapters, we want to explore this really fascinating new perspective on what it means for something to truly exist, and maybe how we've been misunderstanding the world altogether.
Indeed. Yeah, Basassi's book, it's a really compelling journey through contemporary thought. It focuses hard on this idea of new realism, especially through Markus Gabriel's concept of fields of sense.
Fields of sense. Okay.
Right, and it's a really important intervention, in these debates that have shaped how we even think about reality itself. It tackles some deep questions about what's real and, well, what isn't.
Okay, so before we jump straight into new realism, maybe we should set the stage a bit. Like, what was the thinking before this? What is new realism reacting against? Where did it all start?
Right, good place to start. Well, for a long time in Western philosophy, going way back to Plato, Aristotle, right up through the Enlightenment, the basic assumption was kind of reality's out there. It's independent of our minds and we can, potentially get to know it. But then Descartes came along and we saw this big shift. People call it the mentalistic paradigm.
Mentalistic paradigm.
Yeah, it basically put the perceiving subject, the human mind, right at the center of things. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't seen as direct access to reality anymore. It was mediated, filtered through our thoughts, our mental representations.
Okay. So it's less about seeing reality directly and more about how our minds are kind of processing it.
Exactly, precisely. And this shift, well, it opened the door to a lot more skepticism. You see it especially with figures like Hume and Kant. They seriously question if we could ever really know things in themselves.
Things in themselves, meaning reality as it really is, independent of us.
That's the idea, yeah. Then, fast forward to the 20th century, and you get these anti-realist and constructivist trends really taking off. Thinkers like Nietzsche, Derrida, Foucault. Their work often suggested that reality isn't so much about objective facts.
Right.
It's more about, subjective interpretation or language or how society constructs things.
Okay, and here's where Bossi's book says it gets really interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because this wasn't just some abstract academic thing.
Not at all.
It had actual real-world impact. It shaped how we talk about truth in public, maybe even fed into this whole post-truth idea we hear about now.
Absolutely. You had thinkers like Paul Boghossian worrying about what he called a fear of knowledge. His concern was, look, if all truth is just perspective, just socially constructed, then how can marginalized groups speak truth to power? Their claims just become one interpretation among many. They lose their sort of objective weight.
It's like saying, well, that's just your truth, even when talking about stuff we can actually check.
Exactly that. And Timothy Williamson pointed out how these kinds of relativistic arguments could be, well, co-opted by anyone, really. Political factions denying established facts, maybe about climate change, for instance. They could just question the very idea of objective truth. He saw it as undermining our shared reality. Even Bruno Latour, who is often linked with social constructivism, later worried about an excessive distrust of good matters of fact. He saw how that skepticism could actually be weaponized.
Weaponized? How so?
Well, paradoxically, by extremist groups, maybe, using those same arguments to dismiss evidence they don't like. And remember the Sokol affair?
Vaguely. Physicist who submitted a hoax paper.
That's the one. Submitted a deliberately nonsensical paper to a big postmodern journal, and they published it. That really highlighted the anxieties a lot of people felt about this kind of intellectual relativism.
Okay, so that's the climate. A lot of skepticism, maybe even a feeling of crisis around truth. So how did new realism pop up as a response? It sounds like it's trying to find a path between extremes.
You've got it. Yeah, new realism tries to push back against that radical postmodern anti-realism, the kind that risks dissolving truth altogether. But it also pushes back against overly simplistic naturalism, the idea that everything just boils down to physics or matter.
So what's the core idea of standard realism then?
Well, basically 2 main points. First, the existence thesis, stuff exists. Objects, properties, facts, they're real.
Okay.
And second, the independence thesis. Their existence, their nature, it doesn't depend on our minds. They're out there whether we think about them or not. Now, within that, within epistemological realism, the idea, we can know reality, you get different flavors. Some are more optimistic, like Markus Gabriel, who's central to Bossi's book. He thinks, yeah, we can access knowledge of reality. It might be tricky, but possible.
And the pessimistic view.
Well, you have thinkers like Thomas Nagel, famously asked, what is it like to be a bat? suggesting some aspects of reality might just be fundamentally beyond our human understanding, or that our knowledge always leaves something out, some surplus of reality we can't quite capture. Gabriel's new realism is really an attempt to reclaim that optimistic view, that sense of objective knowledge.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. So let's dive into chapter 2 of Bossi's book. How does Gabriel actually start to unpack what exists? What are his foundational concepts?
Right, so Gabriel leans heavily on Gottlob Frege's distinction. You heard of Sinn and Bedeutung?
Rings a bell. Meaning and reference.
Exactly. Sinn is like the way something is presented, its meaning, the angle we grasp it from. Bedeutung is the actual thing it refers to, the object itself. The classic example is the morning star and the evening star.
Yeah, Venus.
Right. Two different Sinn, two different modes of presentation, but they both refer to the same Bedeutung, the planet Venus.
Got it. So how does Gabriel use this?
He applies it to his idea of ontological descriptivism. Now, this is pretty radical. He says objects aren't just bare things out there. They are, get this, bundles of senses or objective modes of givenness.
Bundles of senses. What does that actually mean?
It means there's no such thing as just pure existence. Everything exists as something specific, as a so-and-so. An object, for Gabriel, is fundamentally identical to everything that can be truthfully said about it. The sum of its properties, its senses.
Okay, whoa. That's quite abstract. Can you give us that aha moment, like make it concrete for us?
Absolutely. Let's take fictional characters. Think Sherlock Holmes or Faust's witches from the play. They exist, right? But how? They exist as described within their specific fictional fields of sense.
Fields of sense. Okay.
Yeah. They don't exist like you or me walking around. But within the context of Doyle's stories or Goethe's play, their existence is totally definable. It has specific characteristics. We know Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street. That's an objective fact within that field. You wouldn't ask about his blood type unless a story mentioned it, right? It's outside that field.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And facts. How do they fit in?
Similarly, for Gabriel, facts are just that which is true about something, and they exist independently of us. The facts say that the sun is bigger than the moon. That would still be true, even if no humans were around to notice it. It's a truth given within a specific field of sense astronomy, in this case. And all this leads to Gabriel's core idea, maybe his most revolutionary one. Existence is appearing in a field of sense.
Existence is appearing in a field of sense.
Right. It's not just a catchy phrase. It's the bedrock of his ontological pluralism. This is the thesis that there isn't just one field or a few. There's an indefinite, maybe even unlimited number of these fields of sense. And crucially, they aren't just subjective viewpoints.
Not just my perspective.
No, they're objective realms, domains where objects and facts are genuinely given.
So, like, the field of Roman language studies you mentioned.
Yeah.
That's as objectively real in its own domain as physics is in its domain. No hierarchy.
That's exactly Gabriel's point. Each field defines what exists within it and how it exists. He even talks about modally robust objects versus less robust ones.
Modally robust?
Yeah, things like numbers or galaxies. They exist regardless of us, our attitudes, our practices. The number 7 just is, whether we think about it or not. Galaxies are out there, whether we see them or not. But then you have other things, like, say, an election campaign. Or a specific piece of music by Itri Effendi. These are less modally robust. They depend on humans, on our practices, our creation, our engagement.
Okay.
But within their fields, the field of politics, the field of music history, they absolutely have their own reality. Their own existence is perfectly definable there.
Wow. Okay, what's really fascinating here is this idea that existence is always relational. It's always restricted to a field. You can't just, like you said, pull a witch out of a novel and expect her to exist like a person.
Exactly.
And you can't understand a philosophy book just by, I don't know, analyzing its atoms. Everything exists as something specific within a context, this whole idea of contextual existence. It must have some really interesting things to say about what doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Which I think brings us to chapter 3.
Yeah, it raises a big question, right? If everything exists in some field of sense, what about things that just don't exist? Like, at all. How does Gabriel handle non-existent objects?
Right. The problem of non-existence. Well, Gabriel's theory connects with something called formal Meinongianism, named after Alexius Meinon. Yeah, he argued, quite controversially back then, that we can think about and talk about non-existent objects, like a round square, or a golden mountain, maybe. Even if they don't exist in our physical world, he said they still have properties.
How can a round square have properties? Well, it has the property of being round and the property of being square, even though those properties contradict each other in physical space or Euclidean geometry. Minong made a distinction: existence for real-world things versus subsistence for abstract things like numbers or even impossible things like round squares.
Okay, so how does Gabriel use this?
Gabriel's take is kind of similar, but framed through fields of sense. When we say X does not exist, we aren't saying X is just nothingness. What we're really saying, in Gabriel's view, is X exists in a different field of sense than the one we're currently focused on.
Oh, I see.
So a round square, it doesn't exist in the field of, say, things you can draw on a piece of paper according to standard geometry, but it absolutely exists as an impossible concept within a logical field of sense, or the field of philosophical puzzles, perhaps. It lets us talk meaningfully about fiction or impossible ideas without claiming they're physically real.
That's actually quite a neat way around it. So
Yeah.
if everything exists somewhere in some field, it kind of implies there's no pure nothingness, just different modes of existing.
Yeah.
And this whole framework, this leads to what you called one of his most striking claims: the world does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That sounds incredibly radical, like
Oh.
deeply counterintuitive.
It does. It really does. And it's so important to get what he means by the world here. He's not saying your experience of, the animal world or the world of finance or just the world outside your window.
Yeah.
He's not denying that.
Okay.
No, it's a very specific philosophical claim. He's arguing against the idea of a single, total, all-encompassing container, a big box that holds everything, all possible fields of sense. He's rejecting concepts like the universe as a whole, or the absolute, or some ultimate unity that supposedly contains absolutely everything that exists.
Yeah.
That world, he says, doesn't exist.
Okay. Why not? How does he argue for something that sounds so final?
Well, he uses a formal argument basically tied to his ontological pluralism. Remember, existence is appearing in a field of sense. So if the world, this supposed big box containing everything, existed, it too would have to appear in a field of sense. But think about that. If the world appeared in a field, that field would have to be, in some sense, bigger than the world itself to contain it.
Yeah.
But if that field is bigger, then the world wasn't really the all-encompassing totality we thought it was it? It becomes a contradiction.
Okay, I think I follow that.
And there's another angle. If the world was an object within itself, if the big box contained itself, you'd get this weird infinite regress, like Russian dolls, but infinite. The world containing the world containing the world, infinitely duplicating everything. Gabriel says this kind of structure, this totality, it just doesn't work. It contradicts the very idea of distinct fields allowing objects to appear within them. There's no single field that can hold all the other fields. There's always something outside any given field.
Okay, the book brings in an analogy here, right? Hilary Putnam's cube allegory. Can you explain that? How does it help?
Yeah, Putnam's example is helpful. Imagine 3 cubes sitting on a table. If I ask, how many objects are there? You'd probably say 3.
Right. 3 cubes.
But Putnam says, well, what if we count not just the cubes, but also their parts? Their surfaces, their edges, their corners. If you count all those plus the cubes, maybe you have, 7 objects or more, depending on how you count. This is what Putnam called conceptual relativity. How we conceptually divide up reality depends on our framework, our counting scheme.
Okay, so how we describe it changes the number.
Right. Now, Gabriel takes this a step further. He doesn't just say our concepts are relative. He argues that reality itself is structured this way. He calls it ontological relativity. It's not just about how we think about things differently. It's that reality itself fundamentally exists in these multiple equally valid structures. There isn't one single pre-given way reality is carved up. No final count.
Wow. So it's not denying reality exists. It's saying its structure is inherently plural, maybe even perspective dependent in a deep ontological way. It's trying to, save the phenomena, acknowledge everything we experience without forcing it all into one box.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It pushes back against this hierarchical view where, say, physics is the most real thing and everything else is just sort of secondary.
Right.
Instead, Gabriel emphasizes that all these diverse phenomena are equally real, just within their own fields. Think about a human hand. In physics, it's a collection of particles. In biology, it's cells and tissues. If it's tattooed, it could be a work of art.
Okay.
All these descriptions are true, objectively true, within their specific fields, and no single field gets to say, I'm the real description. They're all accessing different but equally valid aspects of reality. Human knowledge can grasp these different realities without needing to reduce them all down to just atoms, for example. This embrace of pluralism is absolutely key to Gabriel's new realism.
Okay, so connecting this all up, Gabriel's ideas are definitely provocative. They challenge a lot of assumptions. But Bossy's book, in Chapter 4, doesn't just present them, right? It also raises some critical questions about Gabriel's system itself, its consistency, its implications.
That's right. Bossy does engage critically. One big question he raises is about this no-world view and the idea that there's a necessary multitude of fields. Does this maybe implicitly lead back to some kind of radical Platonism?
How so?
Well, if things like mathematical objects necessarily exist in their own fields, and these fields themselves are supposedly infinite and necessary, what's the grounding for that necessity? Why must there be all these fields and objects? Just saying each field follows its own rules might not fully explain why this whole complex structure has to exist in the first place. It leaves questions about the ultimate basis of this ontology.
Okay. And what about Gabriel's claim that his approach is an ontology without metaphysics? Does Bossy buy that?
That's another major point of critique Bossy explores. He argues that, well, despite Gabriel's intentions, the system seems to rely on some pretty significant metaphysical assumptions.
Like what?
Take ontological descriptivism, the idea that everything exists as a so-and-so, identical to its bundle of senses. That's a huge universal claim about the nature of all existence. That sounds pretty metaphysical, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does seem like a foundational claim about reality itself.
Exactly. And likewise, ontological pluralism, the idea of infinite, necessary fields of sense, that also functions as a big metaphysical claim about the fundamental structure of reality. These aren't just observations. They seem like core metaphysical commitments.
And this then leads to another tricky question, doesn't it? If there are all these equally real fields and no big box world, does that really mean there's no hierarchy at all? Our intuition kind of screams that, say, the physical universe seems more fundamental than, I don't know, the world of Harry Potter.
It's a very powerful intuition, and Bossy directly probes Gabriel's flat-footed rejection of hierarchy. He asks, for instance, how could a work of art or even a philosophy book like Gabriel's own even come to exist or manifest if there wasn't some kind of underlying physical reality enabling it?
Right. It suggests some fields might depend on others, even if they're distinct.
Precisely. It points towards a kind of foundational dependence that Gabriel's equal reality thesis tries to avoid. So while the fields might be distinct, maybe some are enabling conditions for others. And Bossy also notes something interesting. Despite Gabriel really setting himself against postmodernism and constructivism, his ontological relativity actually sounds quite similar in some ways to ideas like Hilary Putnam's internal realism or W.V. Quine's conceptual relativism. Ideas where our conceptual schemes or languages play a pretty big role in shaping what reality looks like for us.
So maybe closer to those ideas than Gabriel might like to admit.
Bossy suggests that, yeah, he even floats the idea that Gabriel's anarchic realism, as some call it, could almost be seen as a kind of postmodern realism, or maybe even an idealist or constructivist realism, despite Gabriel's intentions. So the book concludes that the full consistency, the implications, especially around how these fields relate and overlap, that's still very much up for debate in philosophy today.
Wow. What a journey, really. We've covered the landscape of new realism, dug into Gabriel's big ideas, ontological descriptivism, pluralism, the whole no worldview thing, and looked at Bossy's critical take on it all. His analysis really does unpack this dense philosophy and makes it, well, graspable and definitely thought-provoking.
It really does. The book shows how new realism is trying to carve out this space, between a kind of reductive materialism that maybe feels too limiting and this unchecked relativism where truth seems to just disappear. It's a serious attempt to account for the richness of reality across all its different domains.
So, thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening right now? Reflecting on Bossy's analysis of Gabriel, here's a thought to chew on. If existence always shows up within a field of sense, and there's no single master world holding it all together, well, what new fields of sense might you discover? Or maybe even help create in how you understand reality, and what kinds of objective truths might emerge from those distinct ways of making sense of things? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.